wonder if I need to put my Zoom on. Do I need to bring my computer, or it's fine? On behalf of the UC San Diego Design Lab, welcome to Design at Large. I'm Maya Nichols, a member of the Design Lab community and organizer of Soft Structures in Hard Times, the fall 2022 Design at Large lecture series. We're here on Zoom and in person at the Design Lab on the UC campus, situated on Kumeyaay land. This public acknowledgement serves to honor and respect Indigenous peoples and their land on which our campus resides. UC San Diego was built upon the territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. From time immemorial, the Kumeyaay people have been part of this land. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. I'm very excited to welcome our first speaker to the series, Professor Ty Smith of the University of British Columbia. Professor Smith is a renowned design historian of textiles, an associate professor in the Department of Art History, Visual Art, and Theory at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. She teaches modern and contemporary art history and media through a feminist queer methodology. Her work truly has opened up the framework through which textiles and fashion have been historicized and theorized. Smith's mode of working on textiles is to read and interpret them through weavers' own writings, wordplay, language, and photography. She introduces to textile history the concept of haptics and the tactile aspects of cloth, making critical and groundbreaking contributions to the field of art history and design theory. The compelling ways in which she writes about these topics drew me to her work as a model for my own research practice. Few scholars working on textiles in this expansive way connect the medium to fields such as photography and theory of the senses, doing history of textiles in an expanded frame and through a rigorous critical theoretical framework. Professor Ty Smith is the author of the key work in the history of weaving at the Bauhaus, a form widely regarded as the famous design school's premier form of art. The book is Bauhaus Weaving Theory from Feminine Craft to Mode of Design. And it importantly centers women weavers, I should mention, such as Audie Berger, who designed these touch panels that I am really obsessed with. So they kind of teach us about how touch and perception are linked, and how the optical is related to touch, and sort of the whole sensory system being connected. So I think for you as designers, this will be a very exciting aspect of Professor Smith's work. She's made further contributions to design and art history and theory in articles such as Art Journal, Grey Room, Leonardo, and Textiles zur Kunst, and in numerous edited volumes and catalogs, most recently for the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Tate Modern in London, and the Museum Brandhorst in Munich. Professor Smith is currently at work on 2 book manuscripts titled Fashion After Capital, Frock Coats and Philosophy through Marx to Duchamp, and the second, Textile Media, Tangents from Modern to Contemporary Art. It is very special to have Professor Smith with us today, also because she has ties to many of us that go back to her and our training in the design and art history fields. She did her PhD at the University of Rochester in Visual and Cultural Studies, a program where Lisa Cartwright taught, and where Professor Smith worked with art historian and AIDS activist Douglas Crimp, which some of you may know, and Janet Berlow, historian of Indigenous art and a quilter and author of a memoir about quilting. And I should also mention that UCSD art historians Fabiola Carranza and Jonah Gray and myself all have ties to the University of British Columbia. And Fabi is now pursuing a weaving practice as well as part of her art practice PhD. So today, Professor Smith will discuss the work of Bauhaus weaver Gertrude Arndt as she turned from weaving to photographic self-portraits in works known as her Masken photo series, made between 1928 and 1931. We'll be hearing a close reading of critical theorist and German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin, his writings on photography, as an interpretive approach to Arndt's works and textiles in relation to costume and embodied performance for the camera, which is interesting given this particular configuration as well. Professor Smith will discuss weaving in relationship to performance, costume, and photography, which we may also think of as soft structures, and in relation to industrial silk, a fabric that invokes the concept of the soft and strong in ways that we introduced last week. Please join me in giving a warm welcome from the Design Lab community to Professor Ty Smith.
Thank you so much, Maya. Can you all hear me? Is everything okay? Good. So, of course, I want to thank the organizers, especially Maya Nichols and also Lisa Cartwright, who are hosting this series and who invited me. I'm so delighted to be here. And also speaking about design, because I have not been around designers since I taught at Maryland Institute College of Art many years ago. And so it's really nice to kind of be back in that context. Also, I want to Shayla Obrecht, thank her because she helped essentially bring me here, the logistics of my visit. So I wanted to thank her as well. So my talk today is split into two sections. The first part comments on a particularly vexing concept, the aura, which was initially put forth by the German critic Walter Benjamin in 1930 and would be used throughout several of his essays on photography. The second part shifts gears to look at the work of this former Bauhaus weaver, Gertrude Arndt, who, after graduating, photographed herself for a series of portraits she called the Maskenfotos, or masked photos, around the same time. So my intention here is to bring these two meditations on the auratic in photography into dialogue, to demonstrate where Benjamin's writing and Arndt's work come into dialogue, but also diverge. Where Arndt sought to expose the aura, we might say, through the photograph to the surface of the film, to render it as a textile-like figure, a kind of cocoon, Benjamin invoked this term only to disguise it, to hide it from what he determined would be its misuse by fascist politics. In both cases, I argue, they demonstrate the potential and pitfalls of soft structures for hard times. Specifically, they ask us to reflect on the model of camouflage. So these words on the screen, written by Walter Benjamin, are haunting. Haunting because they were ascribed sometime between completing a first version of Berlin Childhood around 1900 in the year 1934, and when he stopped working on this manuscript in 1938, leaving it to rest unpublished. Benjamin, as some of you know, was at this time in exile, in hiding, living in Paris. In March 1933, he'd escaped from his home in Berlin from the Nazi government that had just taken over Germany and whose tentacles would soon spread throughout Europe to Austria, France, Poland, etc. And this is also around the time that the final solution, as it's so called, was being crafted that would send Jews like himself to the death camps. If Benjamin understood one thing about his work as a critic and writer, it is that words could be a vehicle of camouflage, of masking. The German mich zu mummen is an old expression, apparently, that means to veil oneself, to wrap oneself up almost like a mummy. But this also means in their flexibility that words can also be mobilized in the most pernicious of ways. So meditating on these words in their English and German versions, I have been struck by the awkward, childlike quality of the sentence. After an enigmatic statement about learning to disguise, or embedded in an ellipse in the German version, is a kind of afterthought, a brief subordinate clause in which he notes that what he really thinks of words, what they are Eigentlich, they really are clouds. Unpacking this cryptic yet matter-of-fact metaphor, that is, reading it generously in the way Benjamin himself advised other critics to do, is a task worth doing. Only a child who allows her or himself to inhabit others' words for a while could be so certain of this relationship between words and clouds. Words are nebulous indeed. Their meanings, their functions, their use are like particles of water in a gaseous form. Certain key words especially tend to disappear as soon as one witnesses or inserts our hands into them, or when they are taken up by someone else. Benjamin knew well that seeking to pin down or define a word was a more than Sisyphean task. It was like trying to catch a butterfly in a widely spaced net. Still, this task was not a thankless one. And indeed, this search, this attempt to grasp, and the failure of grasping could become the method itself. It could be a method of masking meaning. It was this method that he learned as a child, that he found useful as he set out writing in those years in Paris, precariously moving from one apartment to the next, writing about art, when he was really writing about politics. So, as in the second version of the Work of Art in the Age of Technological Reproduction essay, a text drafted over the winter of late 1935 into 1936. In this essay, I will argue, Benjamin mobilized words in an attempt to camouflage himself and certain ideas behind a fog of dialectically interrelated concepts. Justifying his essay's exploration of the superstructure, art and ideas, rather than the base, the economy, he comments in the first section on the stakes of his investigation, as articulated through 19 theses on the complex relationships among art, society, and technology, or images, sometimes statistics he mentions, and various devices of reproduction, film, and photography. These together support a new mode of perception and production. Now, if you, students, have read Benjamin's essay, or even if you haven't and just heard of this famous text, you probably know that there is some discussion of what he called the aura. Typically, people understand the aura as something connected to the traditional and unique work of art, like a painting, but that is lost or destroyed by modern methods of photographic reproduction. Many readers tend to focus on the aura as a stand-in for authority and history, and interpret Benjamin's invocation of this term as a kind of mourning, a mourning of some long past state in which art was unique before it became bastardized. Sorry, I meant to go to that slide. By its photographic reproductions. And of course, these readings are to large degree right. The aura is connected to a unique existence, and as Benjamin calls it, there is a general formula which would suggest, quote, the technology of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the sphere of tradition. By replicating the work many times over, it substitutes a mass existence for a unique existence. But something else is going on here. As Benjamin writes and rewrites, explains and re-explains this term throughout his various essays, rendering it increasingly nebulous, he only makes it more cloud-like as the essay proceeds. Both grasping and ungrasping the aura's role in the complex network that comprises the superstructure and the base, art and society, its myriad connection to things, people, and yes, works of art, Benjamin performs, in a sense, what has happened to aura in modernity. It has been, as he says, peeled from its shell, from history, like the thin membrane that connects an egg to the outer shell, or like the cocoon, which in the process, as it was done in the early 20th century, turning the cocoon into silk, that it would have to be, the German word was entschelt, or like shelling, through a simultaneously mechanical and chemical process. And so in English, it would be like the degumming of the silk. And this, you can see how this one page talks about its treatment with alkali or acid. You could say, note the kind of resonance potentially not simply with textiles, but also with the sort of chemical processes of photography. So interestingly, Benjamin initially spoke about the aura in some notes that he made on a hashish trip he took in 1930 in Marseille. It was there, as the late film scholar Miriam Hansen pointed out in her groundbreaking 2007 article on this key term, that Benjamin experienced what he called genuine aura, which he declared, quote, appears in all things, not just certain kinds of things, say art or saints, as people imagine. Benjamin also wanted, as he indicates in this text, to protect the aura from the equally fascist rhetoric of theosophy, which saw the aura, quote, as a spruced up version of the magic rays beloved of spiritualists and described and illustrated in vulgar works of mysticism. In another essay, Little History of Photography, published in 1931, Benjamin describes how the aura is evident in the earliest photographs. In the moment before photography was fully industrialized, what he calls the incunabula period between its invention circa 1830 and its widespread use in commercial studios. In these images, these early images, he notes, the aura is evident in their proximity to the person or subject being photographed. As with a photograph discussed in his essay of the philosopher Schelling, Benjamin writes, the very creases in people's clothes have an air of permanence. Just consider Schelling's coat. It will surely pass into immortality along with him. The shape it has borrowed from its wearer is not unworthy of the creases in his face. Or, for instance, in this photo by David Octavius Hill from 1843 to 1848, which seems to bury his aura in the folds of fabric. By contrast, he argues, once the portrait photograph became fully industrialized around 1880, the camera, but for a few instances, and he names a few, including the work of Eugène Atget, the photographer. At this point, around after 1880, the camera could only capture the aura in a simulacral form. Thus, by the time Benjamin started drafting the work of art essay in 1935 in Paris, he understood that the aura, to whatever degree its membrane was still intact in various forms or facsimiles in an age of technological reproducibility, it was also being mobilized by the right, by what he and others called the cult of distraction. In this cult of fascism, the aura was becoming a vehicle that inserted celebrities and politicians before the masses to garner their worship. Now, my intention here is not, in this semantic gloss on the aura, is not actually to interpret or pin down the true meaning of this term. Rather, as I've been suggesting, I want to point to the aura's lack of resolve, the fact that it remains so out of focus in Benjamin's writing, sometimes genuine, and at other times a facsimile. Benjamin left this concept, like so many other of his concepts, purposefully unclear, even shifty. This may have been because he never quite figured it out. Even after he published the French and German versions of this essay in 1936 in the second version, he redrafted the work of art essay for a third time in 1939. But I also want to suggest, and perhaps argue, that this lack of resolve was part of a general strategy of hiding or disguising himself, as he said, among words. In a moment when fascism had befallen his home country, he understood the power of this word and its potential for misuse. In other words, this essay, which was written while he was an expat in Paris, mostly hiding out in a library to work on his arcades project, was not just tied by an umbilicus to his precarious biographical status as a Jew on the run from the Nazis, but was also, whether consciously or unconsciously, part of an effort to challenge the discourse of political art, to create critical engagement that is not supported by facile readings and propaganda. The aura was a precarious concept for a precarious moment. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of an interlude here before I move on to Gertrude Arndt. So I'm inserting this here because I feel like I need to kind of provide a sort of theory or thesis of camouflage that will help to kind of as we go forward. So as Hannah Rose Schell has noted in her work on camouflage, and I understand she's speaking as part of this series, which is perfectly coincidental. As I was drafting this, I found that out. Exciting. I will have to listen in on that lecture. Anyway, so Hannah Rose Schell has noted that camouflage basically exploits the realm of visibility and legibility. It enables things like animals or soldiers wearing camouflage to protect themselves from detection while sheltering in full view. Hiding or concealing one's location or identity, the technique of camouflage works to reorient or jostle the gaze of the predator or online data collector. This also means that camouflage is by nature political. Camouflaging an intended meaning or goal can, in the hands of some, become a tool of freedom. In others, it can be a covert means of oppression, a way of masking ideology or harming others without reproach. Motivated by the recognition of a threat, some beings camouflage in order to survive or conserve life. Motivated by a will to power, predators camouflage themselves to better carry out a strike. Camouflaging can be used to subvert certain meanings or cultural codes while amplifying others. In other words, camouflage is a technique that simultaneously hides and conceals polarities of power. So, as promised, I now turn to the work of Gertrude Arndt. On a March day in 1927, Bauhaus weaving student Gertrude Arndt, born Hanschk, took her journeyman's exam in weaving. Several hours later, she determined that she would, quote, never sit at the loom again. Having graduated from the Bauhaus in Dessau after 4 years in the weaving workshop, the artist had spent a lot of time laboring to keep threads in their proper order. Though not especially successfully, one might say, as evidenced in some of these samples, which have very poor selvages. If you're a weaver, you know what I mean. While her distinct sense of color and pattern had earned her a spot at the school, and her carpet designs were famously chosen by Walter Gropius to adorn the floor of his office. That was the image I showed here earlier. This is Gropius's office in Weimar, a reproduction of it. Several samples from her days studying weaving structures and materials, now located at the Bauhaus Archiv in Berlin, reveal that she was not especially dexterous. As I said, the salvages are uneven, and her seemingly random experiments with different threads suggest she lost patience quickly. It is therefore unsurprising that, as soon as she could, she deviated from her training in textile design and went off on a bit of a tangent, both biographically and practically. Initially, after graduating, Gertrude's path brought her from Dessau to the small town of Probstzella, where she lived for 2 years, taking on the role of wife, as newly married to another Bauhaus student, Alfred Arndt. She soon returned to Dessau, however, as a trailing spouse, with Alfred, who was hired to teach at the school. It was around this time, during this Bauhaus homecoming between 1929 and 1931, that she experimented with self-portraiture on her own in the privacy of her domestic space. Thus, having abandoned weaving entirely, she jumped disciplines and headed into the tangential space and practice of photography. In these years, Arndt photographed herself for a series of almost 40 images that she called mask photos. In these beautiful and haunting images, Arndt plays dress up for the camera, experimenting with the self-portrait form by inserting layers upon layers of different fabric stuff into the foreground of the image. Translucent textiles at once camouflage her face and appear to cling to the surface of the photograph, like a filmy membrane, a fungal growth, or the spun threads of an unraveling cocoon. We might say that in Arndt's photographs, we find something like the optical unconscious that Walter Benjamin first detailed in his Little History of Photography essay and further elaborated in the Work of Art essay. Like the quote, split second when a person actually takes a step. This is his quote, the split second when a person actually takes a step, or the infinitely small registers of movement that transpire with the movement of picking up a cigarette lighter. When the camera comes into play with all its resources for swooping and rising, disrupting and isolating, stretching or compressing a sequence, enlarging or reducing a subject, we first discover the optical unconscious. It is this other nature of the textile which speaks to the camera or is felt or grasped by the hand, but not so much the eye, that strangely makes us aware of the fabric's objective tactility. While textiles remain unconscious to us most of the time, as we wear them or sit on them, they cover our walls, in such photographs, they gain a kind of heightened status, perhaps even, as I will discuss in a bit, a kind of auratic presence, albeit in simulacral form. So what happens when the textile becomes an object that is a figure in the photographic frame? What I mean by figure is the following. The textile comes front and center to be the primary and celebrated focus of the camera's gaze. As an object, it appears to be alive, to come alive, as Marx would observe of the fetishized commodity, as if it could dance. But also in the sense of figura, as outlined in Erich Auerbach's philology of this concept, whereby figures are understood both plastically and rhetorically, that is, as objects and as figures of thought. As Auerbach discusses, for the Roman architect Vitruvius, the figura is a model without deception or transformation. It is a mathematically derived schematic. You might think of the diagrams in your design textbooks. Those are technical figuras. But in Lucretius's doctrine of the structures that peel off things like membranes and float around in the air, the word figura emerges side by side synonymously with simulacra, imagine, and effigies. We might add auras. As the textile becomes a figure, it seems to have a face of its own. Likewise, the face of the celebrity shot, like the one you have of Marlene Dietrich here on the left, appears almost textile-like, spun in artificial silk. The word in German is Kunstseide, but in English it's rayon, which is much more prosaic. Anyway, this cultic personality performs the aura for the camera, rendering it a figure. Which points us to perhaps the most prominent, difficult philosophical problem of the early 20th century German context. The apparent unleashing of evil that ensued when photographs and film began to turn objects into subjects and subjects into objects. Indeed, scholars of the Bauhaus and Weimar culture have all discussed the ways in which writers of that era, like Adorno, Benjamin, Krakauer, Lukács, were singularly obsessed with the problem whereby the capitalist mode of production and its interpolation into the Weimar media culture created subjects out of objects and objects out of subjects. Film director Fritz Lang, by contrast, speaking from the angle of a person behind the camera, celebrated the magical way, indeed, in which on film things take part in the action. And they do so just as nonchalantly, he said, and just as naturally as children and animals. Here's Fritz Lang continuing, writing for the 1929 New Year's issue of Der Film, An empty chair, a broken glass, the barrel of a revolver pointed right at someone, the ghostly emptiness of a room no longer inhabited, a door closing or opening on its own. All of these objects are filled with their own life. All possess a face, a personality, and mimic. And they flourish in contact with a material that our epic has also rediscovered, light. Through the force and perfection with which a face, be that of a person or a thing, is submerged from light into shadow or from shadow into light. End quote. I should have provided that quote on the screen. It's a really lovely quote, but maybe in the future. Of course, this process of what Lukács called reification, as many feminist film and art historians have noted, like myself or Elizabeth Otto, concomitantly involves an especially anxious language about gender, specifically femininity, on the part of Krakauer and other Frankfurt School thinkers. This is especially the case in their discourse around the cult of the celebrity, the film diva, but also the, quote, little shop girl audience. The filmic image of women embodies the modern existence of the subject as a reified object. One such problematic character of modern life is that of Lulu in Pandora's Box, played by Louise Brooks in G.W. Papp's filmic adaptation of two earlier plays by playwright Frank Wedekind. The plays were Erdgeist and Die Büchse der Pandora, which was also the German title of the film. When Papp's Pandora's Box first appeared on screen in 1929, it caused much anxiety among German, French, and American film critics who perceived the overt sexual material and unclear moral messaging and the presence of a lesbian character as a threat. For example, it seemed to disturb a number of German leftist critics, like Krakauer, who never commented on the movie directly, but alluded to Brooks's ineffable beauty in his 1933 essay on Greta Garbo. Unlike the German actress Greta Garbo, quote, whose beauty derives from abundance, the American beauty, Krakauer suggested, that is Louise, represents a state of utter emptiness, a being without content, a mere mask behind which nothing hides. We could also compare Louise Brooks, of course, to Charlie Chaplin, who is by contrast something of a hero in the way he gets modern life for a lot of the male German thinkers. Papp's Pandora's Box, along with his other production, Diary of a Lost Girl, also featuring Brooks in the main role, opened in theaters in Dessau in 1929, the same year that Gertrude Arndt returned to the Bauhaus with her new husband, Alfred. Like Louise, Gertrude played dress-up for the camera. In her masked portrait series, her face becomes at once alive and frozen, which is to say simulacral. And as the textiles take on a life of their own, they become less a ground of practice and more a figure in itself. Her photographs present surfaces replete with textures, dresses, scarves, ribbons, lace, and other sundry items made of cloth, sometimes layered so thickly that Arndt looks like a child hiding in the closet while playing dress up. Caught within or behind a net, Arndt's face provides the ground while the fabric's pattern of knots within a net becomes quite visibly the figure. Subtle or bold textiles jostle with Arndt's visage for the lead role. Now, it should be added that the dreamy, dare I say, mystical quality of these images is antithetical, even antagonistic to the dominant language among her Bauhaus peers in 1930. Though here you see, this is also a photograph by Arndt from 1930, that she took of the architecture built by or designed by the founding director Walter Gropius. And this is one that kind of really adhered to the logic of what is called the existence minimum or existence minimum, the principle of architectural functionalism that sought to calculate the minimum required space for living, or rather existence, in lieu of functionalism's sharp geometry and economy. Her Masken photos reveal something else. Arndt presents us in the masked photo series with a theatrical realm of Renaissance actors, Eastern Orthodox Madonnas, and film divas. But again, unlike Lulu, Louise Brooks, who is offered up seamlessly in her silk-like beauty, Gertrude's characters seem to compete with the unruly textiles, veils and layers of cloth that once hide and reveal Arndt, providing her with a vehicle of transformation, of masking and refashioning. Arndt uses textiles to camouflage and recamouflage herself, only inhabiting these clothes temporarily. She slips in and out of them like a ghost or a cloud. Just as we recognize our own gaze peering back at us through the black dots on the veil, we lose Arndt. We can no longer fully capture her as an object. Subject and object become a mesh, as though the threads have been spun backward into the cocoon. Indeed, there is something else going on here, perhaps a different kind of aura. This is more like the messy domain of Weimar cabaret performance than the clean space of either Hollywood or Schlemmer's triadic ballet. Indeed, what Arndt's masked series may show about this moment of the Weimar Republic is something like its underground, its domestic unruliness, its night rather than its day. Rather than Mies van der Rohe's capitulation to the Nazi regime through neoclassicism, Arndt goes into the shadows. Bright sunlight is replaced with the ineffective light of artificial lamps. Here is a young German dealing with the rise of right-wing politics, a life in which degeneracy is retreating into hiding. Now, as an extension of the mask photo series, Arndt completed another set of photographs in 1931, images that captured an intimate moment with her best friend from the Bauhaus weaving workshop, Otti Berger, a student and at this point a teacher there. It would take only 2 more years for the Nazi Party to gain full control of the government, a political shift that led to the regime shutting down the Bauhaus in 1933. In 1936, Otti Berger, a Jew originally from Hungary, now Croatia, was denied her German work visa. She first migrated to London, but because she was mostly deaf, she struggled to learn the English language well enough, and so she eventually moved back to her mother's house in what was then Yugoslavia. Also around this time, the Nazis drafted the final solution, a bureaucratic plan to rid Jews from Europe. Going in and out of hiding, Berger was unable to camouflage herself well enough. She was ultimately captured and put into Auschwitz, murdered there at some point in 1944. So in January 2021, 2 things happened, which would become linked in my mind. And on reflection provides me with something of an origin story for the work I'm presenting today. It also helps me make sense of the stakes of this historical research. First, as some of you might recall, wink, wink, on the late morning of January 6th, after a rally at the Ellipse in front of the White House, a horde of Trump-supporting MAGAs stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C., knocking over barricades and doors and demanding, quote, justice. Many of them emboldened by the conspiracy narrative known as QAnon, or the equally fictitious rhetoric of Fox talk show hosts like Tucker Carlson. The populists claimed that an unfair process led by a cabal of elitist Democrats, read Jews, who apparently manipulated the voting machines using lasers from satellites, had, quote, stolen the election. These words, "Stop the Steal," became a rallying cry for the right, even as they knew very well the statement itself was not true. They had wrested the rhetoric of protest from the Black Lives Matter movement, which had taken over cities across the globe the summer before, and claimed a similar quote, grassroots identity. Exactly 3 weeks later, still traumatized by the spectacle we universally witnessed and mulling its implications for a country I had grown up in and which, for better or worse, I still feel deep connections to, I emailed an older colleague to ask her if she would allow me to sit in on her graduate seminar that term. The topic was Walter Benjamin's Arcades Project, a seemingly outdated historical topic on a dead European man, no less. But I was certain it would help somehow to process the trauma. I wanted to read Benjamin with others, closely and carefully, not as a professor, but as a student of sorts in the darkness of those COVID winter days. I craved the intellectual communion of a graduate seminar, one in which passages from texts could be mulled collectively, one in which we were asked to spend time with words. I was looking for a different sense of communal being in the face of our increasingly atomized existence on screens. Further, while I was not explicitly conscious of the connection at that time, I realize now, looking back, that I understood the serendipity and strange timeliness of the topic. As my colleague noted in her syllabus from that term, Benjamin's Arcades Project, a tome of careful and wide-spanning research about 19th century Paris, was written by the critic mostly during his exile between 1933 and 1938, while he was simultaneously working on Berlin childhood and the work of art essay, among others. The January 6th Capitol invasion was not only deeply frightening because it transpired as a consequence of some orange guy's lazy, stupid, and hateful rhetoric on Twitter, but also because it echoed an uncannily similar event that transpired on February 27th, 1933, when a fire was set at the Reichstag, the parliament in Berlin, Germany, setting the stage for a Nazi authoritarian takeover of government. A similar set of tactics, of celebrity derelict prophets, conspiracy theories, and forged histories had been mobilized in each. The crowds of Christian nationalists definitely mobilized the bold and often Twitter hashtag-focused language of protest and married it to, quote, God's words, turning it into a mechanism, we could say, of fascist control. Against this, I wanted a slower, perhaps softer, more methodological consideration of history. Frustrated with the myopic discourse that had taken over the world, I have felt the need to go deep, yes, deep, that modernist value too often dismissed, to actually read carefully, slowly, generously, to listen. So since then, I have returned to work on this work of art essay, one that begins with a discussion of Marx. What I continue to be struck by with it is the fact that Benjamin deploys this mystical term aura in this essay at all. As I've noted, the aura is mentioned 6 times throughout that essay, but it remains enigmatic, like a cloud. And more significant than any one meaning, I contend, is Benjamin's decision to wrest the aura from the fascists, the politicians and operatives who had co-opted the vocabulary of originality and authority in their charismatic figure of the leader, die Führer, the driver or the leader, as Hitler was called. Like Trump's use of Twitter and then Truth Social, Truth Social, the fascists used film and photography to both distract and mobilize the masses, to get them to fight battles on their behalf. Indeed, Benjamin understood that with fascism, politics had become aestheticized, a complex set of fictions or narratives mediated by spectacles or sensory experiences. In this way, we can understand how aesthetics constitutes the environment in which politics and economics are playing out, running amok, being harnessed. The new perceptual experiences of the masses in which everything becomes equivalent, a statistic, including the aura itself, has again become a weapon. The aura, say in the form of Trump's Truth Social, has been refashioned once again as a mechanism to both distract and gain the cultic adoration of the masses. The superstructure, culture, and beliefs constitute the very site of this struggle. So this is a quote from the New York Times from October 11th, 2020. QAnon doesn't openly fly the colors of fascism. It sells it as secret code. In other words, it camouflages itself. So the QAnon and Christian nationalists, what they're called now, use social media memes to wrest the aura from life. As they provide a cultic spectacle, a cryptic code, their fascism, we need to become more deft, more flexible on social media. Thus, I want to offer one final word, a kind of dictum then for the present moment, these hard times. We need to relearn the ways in which power hides or camouflage itself within words, which, as young Benjamin understood, really are clouds. Thank you. So I believe there are going to be questions and answers period. So I will go sit over there.
Team. One question from me. Thank you very much. That was incredibly informative. I'm new to this field, so thank you for the depth and breadth. I was curious, one of the thoughts I had was about camouflage amplifying. Could you give us maybe an example of that? Because I was finding it hard to try and come up with an example myself.
Okay, can I go back to that slide?
Yes.
Yeah, I also wanted to thank you, Ty, for that wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I love how you started with the photographs and the Mask and Photo series and then moved us landing into hard times. It was such a beautiful way of ending and also of starting with the clouds. And actually, it's funny because, yeah, it's the perfect sort of metaphor, I think, for this idea of how, you know, these forms are inherently political. And I'm not sure if you wanted to address his question as well at the same time.
Yeah, no, I can. I mean, I think they'd speak to the same thing. So wait, where do I talk about the amplifying? Oh yeah. So generally this idea that it's like camouflaging can be used to subvert certain meanings or cultural codes while amplifying others. I mean, I'm thinking there specifically of algorithms, which, you know, function, which are always kind of like hiding in the background, camouflaging themselves, but nevertheless operating very deftly, strategically, so to speak. And where it would seem that camouflage is only about hiding, it's also about kind of foregrounding something else. So in the case of like Gertrude Arndt, for instance, like you might say like the way that she uses these veils where she puts the textile in the foreground. So it's a distracting mechanism. So it can amplify the distraction over what is being hidden or what is hiding, so to speak. So that's, I guess that would be how I would answer that question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up if no one else has a question, but please feel free to raise your hand if you do have a question. Oh, okay.
Well, why don't you ask your question first?
Yeah, I have a question. So, because one of the things I was also struck by in your presentation was when you showed, so something I've also been wrestling with it in my own work is this idea of sort of ornamentalism or sort of veiling or sort of decoration and the decorative in relation to when you showed the second slide of the Le Corbusier functionalism and this idea of everything being completely functional. So how do you reconcile that with these works that are, you know, how do we not dismiss Arndt behind her masking? You know, how do we not continue to have that narrative of, so I don't know if you could speak more to her identity too, like her political, like how does it become political when there's always this difficulty of extracting, you know, the woman, especially as a weaver, from this sort of relegated position? How do we like work through that, and what is the relationship to modernism, I guess, and this sort of functionalist shift?
I think what you're getting at in your very complex and compelling question is how complex it is.
Yeah.
And I think that like, okay, so you mentioned like several things. One, which was the decorative and like, how do we not dismiss this as merely decorative? It's just like she's using these veils and things like, is this not? And I would say first, in answer to that question is something like the formal reading I'm doing, where I'm thinking about what these things are doing that might not all only be decorative, that might also function in a different way. But then you also brought in the question of her identity as a woman, a former weaver at the Bauhaus. And of course, I don't know if this has been mentioned before, but the weavers at the Bauhaus were mostly women, not entirely, but mostly women, because women who entered the Bauhaus were shuttled into that workshop of the school. So by definition, weaving was feminized from the get-go. But of course, there's a longer history of it being feminized with the textile industry, but that we won't get into that. But so the kind of the way that identity and discourse, you kind of can't separate them, because there's the discourse around weaving, which is also producing the fact that the weavers there are women. And then you were referencing like, well, how do you kind of find her in those images, or maybe her political position? And I mean, I would say like that's a much harder thing to do. Sometimes it's overt, but most of the time it's not. And maybe things I've kind of come to realize are not political intentionally, but bear so much political value or some kind of aesthetics that is political in the end anyway, especially when you start to see it as compared to everything else going on, like I said, at the Bauhaus, with architecture that's like all about the white wall and not decorative. And there's actually a really interesting debate in the early 20th century around this time about the decorative not only being feminine, but degenerate. So decorative degeneracy, you know, it was called primitive in some very awful language. It was called like, you know, it was like Adolf Loos, who was an Austrian architect, compared it to the scatological. So it's like, you could say that they're in that context, the decorative is a politics, whereas in maybe another context, it's not. So you always have to contextualize, right? And so there's like I would say that a complex answer to a complex question. Yeah.
So I was hoping, Ty, that you might be able to say a little bit more about the background of weaving and the primacy of weaving in the Bauhaus. You know, I was really struck in your talk about the description of the rugs on the floor of Gropius's office. And so there's a lot of literature about the importance of weaving as perhaps the premier art of the Bauhaus, but the weaving, yeah, it's an argument, right? But the weaving in that time seemed to be very much aiming toward abstraction. And there's this fetishization of Annie Albers and the abstraction, and Berger is really not well known. There's this fabulous photograph of her at the top of the high loom, you know, and the fact that she becomes the subject of this masquerade is intensely ironic, you know, just before her death. So I think that for some of us here in the design lab, there's not a lot of focus on the Bauhaus and on the design history of the Bauhaus. So I know that given that you're one of the primary experts on this, maybe you could just say a little bit more about the background of the weaving that's so important to the understanding of what it is that you're having to say about photography and fascism.
Yeah, we'd be happy to. And yeah, I mean, it's funny, right? Because every single time you go into a new talk, you're like, oh, well, I'm assuming everyone knows all that, right? Of course you don't. So, so the Bauhaus started, it was a school of, it wasn't really called design then, but it was called a school of art and craft, essentially. It was famously founded on the principle by Gropius that it would combine both the fine arts and the crafts. And so the curriculum was set up such that it had like theory courses, which are essentially where the art was taught by the form masters, by painters like Vasily Kandinsky, the Russian abstract painter, or by Paul Klee, or by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who's a constructivist and photographer. Yeah, of course. And so, yeah, so they taught the kind of like theory component. And then there were these workshops where the kind of crafts were made and where they made, and then later on made prototypes for mass production. Although to some degree, actually what's interesting about the Bauhaus weaving workshop, it was the only workshop to exist the entire duration of the school. It was the only one to actually be outfitted with tools from the very beginning, because the looms were there previously. And it stayed, stayed for the duration, but it transformed over time. So early on, they made like abstract pictures of wool, abstract, like almost like paintings in wool, right? As rugs or as wall hangings. And then they started to create more functional fabrics, curtains, wall covering, upholstery, etc. They started to design stuff that was, and interestingly, as it started to, like, I have like an article about this, like as it came into the public image bank, as it was photographed through these like close-up photographs of textiles, precisely at that moment that it was also retreating into the periphery within the architectural space. So it was no longer like on the wall as a nicely framed picture, but was just surround the space, like like wall panels that are more haptic, tactile, haptic, really, you know, like about sound and muffling sound than anything. So anyway, so the school school goes through transformations, and the weaving workshop along with it goes through transformations. And it was from the get-go, as I mentioned, primarily a place that was it became associated with what was called the women's class, which was founded in like 1920, I forget, 21. And so it was like a female space. And so there's all the politics of that around it as well. And the artists, and a lot of the artists like who were the form masters of the weaving workshop, I think Paul Klee was the nicest, but the rest were like, I will never pick up a piece of yarn ever. You know, like they were very anti-textile. So you say it's like the preeminent, but it's actually was so dismissed at its time. And it hasn't been until, you know, Sigrid Wortmann-Gewelke wrote about it in the 90s, the weaving workshop, that it's had any presence in the discourse. And then like when I wrote about it too, it was still like people were like, you want to write about what? As for Annie Albers, she did become a bit of a superstar in the American context. And part of the reason for that is because she was frankly married to Joseph Albers. So she had that kind of like recognition, name recognition, last name Albers, Joseph Albers being the famous painter of Homage to the Square. Anyway, so yeah, so it's a complex history. Yes. Feminized version. Yeah, I mean, although she actually said, there's some really great quotes, because she, on the one hand, she was like, yeah, actually, if you think about weaving, if you think about practice, is actually more masculine than feminine. And she had like a whole kind of like, this is not feminine. Like, what are you talking about? It requires a tremendous amount of math. It's a very structural, really complex practice that's closer to architecture than it is to painting, which is like free form and decorative and floaty. And like, she was not interested in that at all. So it wasn't really the feminine. And but she did also laugh at the fact that like, she didn't have a gallery like representation in like the 60s. And she was like, well, I guess if it's on paper, it's art. You know, like she was savvy. She understood that those hierarchies were very profound. Anyway. I think there was a
Question about linguistics, which is.
Oh, great.
Okay, yeah. So I'm Ian Gross, a first year undergrad in Cog Sci. But anyways, my question was basically just like in the same sort of way that you have like in camouflage, you have like the work with that within aesthetics and textiles. Do you think that there's some parallels between that? I see you mentioned codes in particular there, and code switching in linguistics, as in like in racial and queer communities, in the similar ways that it can both hide your identity from people who aren't a part, but at the same time sort of amplify your identity and promote almost an in-group sort of bonding and community aspect of it as well?
Yes, absolutely. That was a great question. And I mean, just yes. I mean, I definitely think that, I mean, and it's funny that a lot of this happens through the clothing that we wear, right? And so the code switching and these sorts of like, they're linguistic, but they're also material. They're also through what we put on, which can become more visible, more amplified. and can hide certain things about one's identity while putting other things about one's identity forward. And so, yes, absolutely. I love that question because I totally think that that's kind of central to my own methodology. So the hope is that, so I'm glad that that was transmitted.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know at least among my friends, some of whom are queer, they like some people, and in that community at large, some people have like debate over whether you can really dress in a queer way. And so I think to some extent you maybe can, but like that at the same time, not everyone who dresses in a certain way may be, and that might be a form of camouflage itself, whether you choose to dress in a way that correlates with your community or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so all for the next queer linguistics design class for the lab between visual arts.
Oh yeah,
art
no, and I
side
would say
computer
that like
science.
it's funny because you bring that up because I would say Benjamin is very queer in the way he uses language. And I kind of like I'm really into like thinking of his words like Jack Halberstam and the Art of Failure. Like that's like so Benjamin is so queer in that way. So I mean, I would encourage you to kind of like look at Benjamin, really read him carefully, and you'll find the queerest of words. I mean, I'm not saying that he was himself queer, although who knows, right? You know, people change and people. Oh, sorry, I've got to hold this up further. Yeah, but I think that it's and he's like an incredible writer who really kind of works with language in the most mutable of ways, strangest of ways. So. Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Zoom. Is it going to be ventriloquized or something by someone?
We have a question from Christian Molina. Can you speak a little more on the Arcades projects as Benjamin's architectural project with literature and the connection of the dismantling or deconstruction of the institution spaces from what you mentioned with the January 6th event? Thank you.
Oh, wow. Oh my God. Thank you for that question. It's funny, like, right. I mean, the January 6th event and thinking about the architecture there and the sort of, like you could have, the January 6th commission could be the Arcades project, right? Like at some point. So if people are not familiar with the Arcades project, it's really what it's called after the fact, though I think he might have called it that then too. I can't remember, but he just talked about it, about his work on the Paris arcades. He was looking back at the 19th century, he said, in order to understand his present in the 1920s and 30s, or 1930s mostly when he was working on it. So he was doing all this research in the French Bibliothèque Nationale while he was living in Paris, but he also did some research in Berlin libraries before he emigrated to Paris. Anyway, and so he was really interested in France, Paris as the quote capital of the 19th century to kind of frame his understanding of like what has happened to this relationship between ourselves and mass culture and architecture and everything. And so he goes through and he culls like millions of quotes. And what he ends up with are basically these files that are called convolutes. And in all of these convolutes, they're kind of like on these different topics. And there's his quotes, and then there's his commentary on the quote. And then sometimes it's an analysis, and sometimes it's just the quote. Anyway, it's a chaotic text that's kind of montaged together. But the question about the January 6th and architecture. So yeah, the Arcades project is kind of like, and has a kind of architectural sort of theme to it. And the January 6th obviously is an architecture that was and then became the kind of site for what would then become a new kind of Arcades project, which is the January 6th Commission. Oh, soft architecture was the question. Okay. Well, I mean, so one of the things that I was thinking about going into this was language that is elastic and flexible and mobile. So for Benjamin's Arcades project, it's not just about the physical space or the hard architecture, but about all of these, his analysis and all of these other critics that he's taking up their analyses and sort of fluid and very kind of crazy interpretations of the role of fashion within them and the role of like mass culture in its various crazy and sundry forms. So it's soft in that it's not like, it doesn't provide like a full hard theory, right? Like as a methodology, it is not hard. It is soft. It is queer, as I'm trying to kind of say. Oh wait, sorry, but I hope you mean that in a good way. All good. So yeah, it's like, it's very, it's like, it's unruly too, and it's decadent, and it's like all of these things that we typically associate with soft.
Hi, this is Jonah speaking. Thanks very much for a great talk. I'm kind of curious because the camouflage sort of element that comes up throughout the talk, it's kind of has an interesting, maybe ambivalent way that it's acting in the talk as I understood it, because on one hand, there's the camouflage of Benjamin or of Arendt and Berger, which in some turns out with Benjamin and Berger maybe was not so effective in the sense that they're caught, or they're, they wound up they weren't able to hide effectively. And the other way that camouflage seems to be functioning as having something to do with ideology, or about this is on the January 6th sort of and the Reichstag. In that case, those things didn't, I'm kind of curious about how camouflage goes together in that way in the talk, because in that case, those seem like very highly visible and not hidden and not camouflaged actions. And so I'm just kind of curious where, how they fit together and how that's working for you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I like the word ambivalent that you used to start with, because I do think that camouflage in my writing would be ambivalent. Like I'm not just celebrating it. I'm not saying like, oh, that's what we all need to do. We all need to camouflage. We all need to go into hiding, because we need to recognize that other people are camouflaging too. And so my invoking of the January 6th is not necessarily the action that transpired, although ironically, there were a lot of folks wearing camouflage there, which was like ridiculous because they're not hiding from anything. They're in fact actually amplifying themselves. But the camouflage of the discourse, right? Like you have, the big T, like kind of going around and saying like what this is X and Y, but really that's not the point, right? Like it's just like, this is fake news or this is whatever. And so like all of that is camouflaging all of these other things that are going on. It's just like basic ideology critique, at the end of the day. Like if you kind of look at the way in which he mobilizes this kind of cultic language of MAGA, it like underneath that we have right? Like I usually avoid that metaphor, but in this case, it's like so apt because he's just like, it's just camouflaging his cronies, like figuring out ways to make money by living in the White House and not leaving it, not actually doing anything. Right. Anyway, so like, I guess it's just it's like, here, let me demonstrate for you and then the proud, like the kind of bombast of the language that camouflages some of these other even more insidious things that are happening. And I just keep on thinking of like anyway, I don't usually come to a talk to talk about politics, but like, I can't, like, it's just like, I can't separate my mind from that anymore. So not that I ever did, but now it's like, really, anyway, does that help with the ambivalence question?
Well, it sounds like it is ambivalent, it sounds like. And maybe just on a note before I pass on the mic to whoever else, one figure within the January 6th event that like right away to me was so curious and maybe relates in some way for as you're developing this is the Q shaman who's wearing all of the
Totally.
It's not textiles. I guess they're like animal skins and that kind of thing.
Still in
Anyways,
the
perhaps
fashion.
there's fodder there.
Yeah, the Q shaman guy. I mean, and that's just like, it's again, it's like one of those instances, like this sort of co-opting of the language of the left by the alt-right, wearing it, donning it as a fashion, right? And taking up that sort of discourse was actually quite similar in the Nazi Germany period, where they were taking up the language of theosophy and like spiritualism. And I always like tell my students, like, just remember that the Nazi youth came out of the Wandervogel movement. The Wandervogel, the wandering birds, i.e. this, like, these hippies avant la lettre. So, I mean, it's like, what? Okay, yeah. So you can see how the complexity of these relationships, of these fashions, of these styles, of these identities that don't align in these neat ways. And so people are so frustrated in the contemporary moment. They're like, oh, but it doesn't make sense that they've adopted. And it's like, no, that's been going on for a long time, right? Like language is adaptable. Like, this is the thing that Benjamin was cautious about. He's like, I don't want it to be then co-opted and taken by the right. So I have to hide it in a way. I've got to like scatter my path, or make the path through the language less simplistic, less Twitter-like, in other words. I'm not saying that all Twitter is simplistic, but you know what I mean? Like, it's not like it's not a hashtag.
Yes, we have a question here.
Is this working? Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the talk. I came in expecting a talk on the art of weaving and its relation to femininity and power, and using that as a sort of a rebellion against hard structures. But I got this beautiful talk on so many different art forms, on weaving and photography and linguistics and poetry, and how all those aesthetics are used and intermingled with politics. So thank you for that. I appreciated your advice afterwards of using what I interpreted as like a lens for viewing other art, of criticizing and looking deeper into its functions for ideology and masking and everything. But I wanted to hear what you thought on how we would use this lens and perspective to produce. Being in the design lab, as designers, we are tasked with ideation and creation. So I wanted to hear your imagination for the future in which we use this lens to create, and how we would do that.
Yeah, I'm interested in this like speculative design. I can't remember who coined it, but it's like a Dutch group, Metahaven, right? And I think that they might be the kind of model, now that I think about it. What I mean by that is maybe not. Like I take it, but yes, maybe possibly take a look at their work, Metahaven. But also, if I were to speculate, I don't know if I can. I mean, I think that one of the things that I am interested in, and that design has difficulty with by definition, is ambiguity. And that's partly because design has to be usable, and you can't be ambiguous when you're designing something, because then someone's not going to know how to use it, right? So it's a bit of a kind of dilemma. So I'm not saying that but in the realm of graphic design, however, which is something I think that there's a lot of potential there, perhaps. I'm just thinking like industrial design versus like graphic design, where graphic design you could kind of conceive of ways in which language could literally be where you could kind of like through the design help achieve this ambiguity and this camouflaging, while at the same time being legible to be read. And I mean, and that happens in poetry all the time. And so I think that poetry can I don't know how to transpose that. I'm not a designer of things, especially. So I can't speak to that, but I don't know. I think it's interesting. And when it comes to textiles, I mean, like textiles are like in a way already ambiguous because they could be used for lots of different things, right? Like you could use it for a curtain, or you could use it for a bedspread, or you could use it. I don't. That sounds kind of silly, but like in a way, it's like they're by definition flexible and adaptable, and so maybe there's something in that because it's soft. It can be designed in such a way as to kind of obfuscate. And of course, clothing does, fashion, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
We were saying earlier too, though, about how it's like, I was just thinking it's such a slippery slope with textiles and with design, but I think it's completely relevant to design in the sense that, like you were saying, how the left would co-opt, the signs and the language of the right, or vice versa.
The right would co-opt the left.
The left.
And it could happen the other way too, but I was thinking about the right co-opting the left.
And how that cultural sign, then that's why it's a slippery slope, because it's like these are co-opted forms. This is totally relevant to a designer who's thinking about, how do I make this look or feel, or how these, and that's why it's so fascinating for me, this relationship between, the optical and the psychic and the sensory, as they're all linked. And so when we receive these forms, it's like they're telling us things from a whole roster of things that we've already experienced. So I think as designers, it's important to think about the symbolism and the politics implicit in every kind of choice, that it's sort of built into the structure.
Yeah.
So when you're looking, I would think. And are there any last questions on the Zoom, or?
No, we're good on the Zoom, but we have one more here.
Okay.
I'm more to follow up there, but I think maybe something that would be relevant there along the lines of like the poetry and such, like Lewis Carroll, who was the writer of Alice in Wonderland, he was also a prominent mathematician, if I recall, and so he liked ciphers and those sorts of things. And also, I suppose to some extent with the ideas in math of like the counters diagonal proof, with those, you could all see an example of sort of hiding something in a sense that was more obviously relevant. Like with the poetry there, for example, there's the example of ciphers, like the Baconian cipher, or you might have a cipher of just the first letter in each word or such, and some ciphers that we haven't even solved, which is sort of steganography, hiding things within plain sight. And so that might be what you're thinking of in terms of like what they were saying with trying to combine poetry with camouflage.
Absolutely. Yes. And Lewis Carroll is a fabulous example. Someone that I love the ciphers and the cryptography and the cryptic language that kind of is used to both tell us and hide the meaning from us at the same time, and not necessarily to make us like have to search for it, but also just the pleasure of it being hidden, right? So yeah, that's a really good point. But I don't know if like, and I do one of the things that I would suggest, at least from a linguistic perspective, is that at the very least with words, we need to be careful, because again, like our words are constantly being shuffled and they disappear as soon as we touch them. And as soon as we start to frame them, they become the kind of stuff of other people's discourse, which you can't control. And I'm not saying you can, but in certain instances, I'm just saying you need to be especially careful, because that malleability is also what can bite you in the foot, right? So, yeah, that's going back to the ambivalent question.
That was such a wonderful connection with Lewis Carroll and linguistics. Yeah. Thank you. I wanted to follow up on Christina's point about speculative thinking and tie your response about speculative design and the work of Dunn and Raby, speculative everything, Metahaven. And here we have the first speculative design major in the world, I think. So founded by Benjamin Bratton, that many of the students here are members of, and the faculty. And anyway, we really love speculative everything here. And I wanted to speak to Christina's point, because part of the reason that we brought Professor Smith is that she does history through a way that speculatively designs how we think about the lineages of things. So Christina expected a talk about, hey, this is how you weave, and this is how it's feminist, and maybe we'll say it's queer, but it's all about the weaving. And instead you hear a talk that takes us through weaving through photography and weaving through industrial history and the intersection of those two forms, which is a speculative history, which brings us right back to the design program here, coming out of cognitive science, which is very much about research design and how you design your research. So part of the agenda for Maya and for me is to open up your thinking about design of things to include design of research practice, including history research. So we are really grateful to you, Professor Smith, for giving us our first speculative history lesson, and to Maya for bringing this session together. Maya, can you wrap up with a few statements?
Wait, can I
and
just say
words?
all history is speculative history in my mind?
I'm so happy to hear that. And there's an
But yes.
issue of feminist media
Mhm.
studies that's now on speculative history. And I thought,
That's
wow, your
awesome.
paper really belongs in that.
Oh, that's awesome.
And
Yay.
anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you on behalf of the design lab and on behalf of all the students that are here for your wonderful talk. And we'll be continuing this discussion, I'm sure. So thank you to Professor Smith.
Thank you for the questions. They were fabulous. Thank you.